Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a new day. Please enjoy Nairobi. Nairobi is a fantastic town that I would like you to get a chance to enjoy the beauty of the city. We call it city in the sun, where innovation meets resilience, and where every sunrise reminds us that Africa's future is as bold as its horizon. So today, we have the second fire chat on industrial policy and growth strategies, which is starting shortly. All the panelists, I hope, are here. The brief on this is as an integral component of its 10-year strategy. The AERC intends to launch a research program on industrial policy in Africa as a key factor in the economic transition process. The innovation is that Africa's industrial policy must adapt to shifting global dynamics and the continent's unique socio-economic context, where traditional models of industrialization are less applicable, as growth increasingly comes from sectors like ICT, tourism, food processing, industrial policy, should be part of a broader economic transformation agenda and not a standalone solution. To help countries achieve inclusive and sustainable growth, policies must also address the realities of the large informal labor market, integrating it into the formal economy and improving productivity and job quality. The discussion in this session will therefore contribute towards shaping the research program by bringing out the key priority areas of policy focus and possible growth strategies. The chair of this session is Professor Andy McKay, Professor of Economics at University of Essex. Andy McKay has been Professor of Development Economics at the University of Sussex since 2006. He teaches development economics to master's students and undergraduates and supervises PhD theses. His research focuses on labor and gender, poverty and living standards, trade and agriculture, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Since 2005, he has regularly served as an AERC resource person and chair of the thematic research group D on production, trade, and economic integration. He also helped coordinate 2 AERC collaborative research projects. He is a current editor-in-chief of the Review of Development Economics and also affiliate professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. Please, Chair, occupy your space. I'll now invite the rest of the panelists to join the chair, and we have Dr. Francisca Lotti, Manager of Institute Growth Program, World Bank, who will join us virtually. I'm told she has already joined. We have Ms. Wangari Muikia, Founder and Managing Director of Expertise Global. Kindly join us, join the chair. Professor Peter Muriu, University of Nairobi, kindly join us up here. Professor Oliver Morrissey, University of Nottingham, kindly join us. And Diana Ann Wanjiku, who is a researcher at AERC. Also, please kindly join us. So, Chair, please take over the rest of the proceedings, and best wishes for the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles, for that kind introduction of B, but also of the entire panel. The whole world is thinking about the importance of industrial policy, and certainly this is a major issue in Africa. This needs to reflect the reality of the world in which we find ourselves at the moment. When we think historically about industrial policy, we think about the successes in East Asia and so on. The world has changed so much in that time. Africa is very different from Asia. The reality of what industrial policy means for Africa and the challenges Africa faces are very different. Got a very distinguished panel joining us today. We will have a series of targeted questions, and I'll address the questions to different individuals. First member of the panel, Francesca Lotti, will join us online. She is lead economist in the Institute for Economic Development in the World Bank. She's got a PhD from Sant'Anna University. She worked in the Bank of Italy before joining the World Bank. Welcome, Francesca. Second is Wangari Mukia, who's a fiscal policy economist, founder and managing director of Expertise Global. 20 years of experience of working on assisting stakeholders to tackle complex fiscal issues. Quite a strong focus on gender as part of these, gender equality as part of these discussions. She's got a master's in public policy from Harvard. Welcome, Wangari. Peter Murio from University of Nairobi, senior lecturer, PhD from the University of Birmingham. Guess who was his advisor there? Of course, the executive director, Victor. His expertise is therefore particularly in the area of finance, but in many other areas as well. Thank you. Welcome, Peter. Oliver Morrissey from the University of Nottingham, who's a long-standing supporter and friend of AERC, long-standing resource person involved in many AERC projects. We've also been colleagues and known each other for a very long time. PhD from the University of Bath, has worked at the University of Nottingham for a very long time. Also supervised many PhD students, some of whom I think are with us at the moment. Welcome, Oliver. And last but not least, Diana Ann, who has studied at the University of Nairobi, has got first degree and master's degrees from the University of Nairobi. She's currently an AERC intern. She's similarly got quite experience on women empowerment issues, and we're very grateful for you for joining us and giving us your perspectives. So what we'll do is we'll have a series of targeted questions where I'd like people to just talk for a little bit. Romain set a very good standard for these fireside chats yesterday. I'm going to ask people to sort of comment in about 3 minutes on the questions that I ask them. And so the first question I'd like to ask to Francesca. Francesca, you're with us? The first question is about rethinking the classic growth model. So Africa's had a reliance on sound macroeconomic policy. That's always been perceived as being important. Having strong macroeconomic fundamentals and export-led strategy and so on. She's not yet. Should we go to the next question? Okay, so Francesca's not yet joined us, so we'll take that question in a minute. So we'll go to the second question, which I'll address to you, Diana, and you can be the first person to comment. And this is a question about whether industrial policy is a bandwagon that everybody feels that they have to do, is this a sort of, as countries are increasingly adopting industrial policies, should African governments follow suit? Should African countries pursue industrial policies? What risks do they face if they don't? In a world where everyone's doing or talking about industrial policy, what are the implications for Africa? Diana, in 3 minutes or so.
Thank you, Professor Andy. So the first question we can ask ourselves is, why is it a bandwagon? Why is the industrial policy bandwagon right now? Why is it existing? We are seeing a lot of economies pouring money into strategic industries, and industrialization, production on global value chains has risen, and investment flows are actually directed towards production policies that are building industry. The market demand is also changing. The market is requiring, excuse me, the market is also requiring processed foods rather than the raw materials. So why is there a bandwagon? Because now we are moving towards strategic industry. We're moving towards green production. We're moving towards digital production, tech, all these factors. So I would say that it's very opportune for Africa to join that bandwagon. Why? Because one, the manufacturing sector in Africa is growing. We are seeing that we have a lot of, right now we have around 15% of manufacturing in Africa. That is a total of GDP. But we're still growing. We're realizing that there is great potential in terms of skill, in terms of the raw materials, in terms of potential for infrastructural growth. So Africa is no longer a young baby, and that is becoming very clear to the global world and to Africa itself. We are now being forced to start winning, start joining the global markets. So now Africa is, I would say it's opportune to join the bandwagon because we are now realizing our potential. We are now realizing that we have young people who can, drive the industrial policy in a way that we can harness tech, we can harness the digital world, and that obviously spearheads industry. Another thing we know that is we are going towards green production, green industry. And for Africa, it's very opportune because our carbon print is very low. So we are starting from a point of learning where we are not first making the mistakes of, producing environmentally degradation, but we are starting at a point of where now we have learned from the mistake that the first world did, and we are joining in at the point of where production is becoming sustainable, industry is becoming green. So for Africa, I believe that we are at a point of where we can harness all these opportunities, all these learning schemes to grow and be industrialized. So let's take this opportunity. It's not a matter of industrial policy or not. It's a matter of how to make it smart, how to make it disciplined, how to make it within and customize it to Africa so that we are able first to move towards the global level. We are competitive in a global nature. Also, we see that domestic demand itself is growing. Regional trade is growing. So we can harness that place and start from the point of regional trade and industrialize ourselves, ensuring that we meet regional market demand, and that will spearhead us to the global platform. Yeah, that's my take on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And I think we'll come later to this point about the extent to which industrial policy in Africa should be different or not. Do we know if Francesca's with us yet, Charles? Not yet? Okay. So we'll come to Wangari in that case, and here we'll think about constraints on African governments, which I think is something you've got plenty of experience on. Given the constraints on fiscal space, given issues of government commitment, given small domestic markets in many countries, which industrial policy tools are more realistic and more effective in Africa?
Thank you very much. It's quite an interesting question. And, you know, the conversation, if you put on the news or, listen to read any newspapers, is really about the fiscal space, right? We're always talking about the money, the revenues that we collect in many of our African countries. Big percentage of that revenue goes to paying debt, which leaves very little space for the country to really implement its budget. So when we think about industrial policy, we're really working with a small pool of resources with which to then, progress the country's objectives and to achieve the country's planning. So really, we can't afford this expensive state-led interventions or subsidy programs that we had of old. We have to really think innovatively around how we can use the limited resources that are available to catalyze the economy. And I can think of three main policy levers with which we can do this. There's several others, but I think these are the three main ones within the context of this summit. I think the first one is thinking about how can we create globally competitive fiscal systems within our countries. And what do I mean by this? I mean, how can we look at the ecosystems and build and have government build, tools or facilities that encourage the private sector to really thrive in these spaces. A good example, if you think about the Tanja Med port in Morocco, Morocco didn't come in and build specific infrastructure in a specific area or like specific public investment. They built an ecosystem, or invested in an ecosystem that supported the growth of the port, the automotive industry there to really thrive. So I think thinking more globally, thinking more enabling environment, and thinking how do you look at particular niche industries and opportunities and help the ecosystem to really thrive and to develop itself into what is needed for a globally competitive ecosystem. The second one is what I'm calling permissive but regulated innovation. So even within the context of the AERC, there's a lot of research and innovation that comes out from the work here. So how can the governments enable industry to start off and to think about implementing some of these research ideas and innovations without coming in strongly on innovation and essentially killing industries that might be flourishing, right? So an example I can think about is, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya, right? M-Pesa started off slow from a private sector perspective, and the industry, the regulative industry, allowed it to grow, watching, but allowing it to grow without severe intervention, and then managing regulation as problems or issues started to arise, to address those issues as they start to arise, rather than coming in strong in the beginning with regulation that serves to stifle, that can stifle burgeoning industry. So coming in from innovation, from a growth but regulated perspective. And the third one is in the spirit of thinking about the informal economy, fiscally targeted support. And what do I mean by this? When I think about some of the different economies or informal economies in all our African countries, I think about some of them growing in Kenya, in the urban areas. And some of these tend to remain small and operating under the radar. And what government tends to do is come in strongly trying to formalize and encourage formalization and coming up with all these tax incentive or tax payment programs to get informal sector players to pay taxes and to contribute. And I think there's a different way of thinking about this. I think that we should look at the industries that are emerging naturally and create assets or targeted investments that allow those informal industries to innovate, to test, and to enhance their productivity, right? So I was reading yesterday about a place in Nigeria called Newi. My friend in the back helped me to pronounce this in the right way. They have a specialty in automotive parts. So the government, the state or the federal government could think about creating a lab that allows the informal sector to come and test new materials, test new innovations, test new machinery, engines, or whatever it is, right? For them to start to scale and grow and enhance their productivity. And once productivity is enhanced, then they start to self-formalize. And once you have them self-formalizing, then they start to become a formal part of course, of the economy and start to pay taxes, which is much needed for fiscal growth. So I think these are important levers. I think these are ways that we can get into to get industrialization growing within the fiscal constraints that we're currently experiencing.
Thank you, Wangari. That's very insightful and really recognizing the reality of the environment that many African countries face and the constraints that they face, but also the potential opportunities. Yesterday we heard the story about TAD Motors and so on. So there are successes and there are good examples. Do we still not have Francesca? Okay. So we'll continue then with a question to Peter then, which is about for thinking industrial policy, what industries, what sectors are we thinking about? How do we choose? How can African countries identify and support industries which align with a comparative advantage? And we think of sectors like agriculture, mining, and tourism, but also potentially other sectors. Peter, can you sort of give us your thoughts about choosing the right industries to support with industrial policy?
Thank you, Ade. Actually, African countries have no problem with choosing or identifying sectors that they have comparative advantage. The problem is what to do with those sectors once they have identified them. As you all may be aware, 83% of African countries are dependent on primary export commodities. If you look at the export concentration, you'll find for Africa is quite high, for East Asia is quite low. What does that tell you? If you look at the diversification index, you find that for Africa, it's quite low. For East Asia, it's quite high. So where is the problem? So there are three sectors. There is the mining, there is the agriculture, depending with factor endowments. And there are those countries that do not have mining or have agriculture because purely much of the country is desert. But they could have some comparative advantage on tourism. Let's say about mining. The issue is not exporting raw mineral, because this is what we've been doing. If you look at the data from 1960, for instance, the manufacture added value as a ratio of GDP, it has stagnated for Africa. So we do the mining and we export raw. So the question is, how do we convert lithium into processing and manufacturing the same so that we move from lithium to lithium batteries? We have had a lot of problem in Africa on backward, forward leakages when it comes to minerals because it really creates employment. A good example is Uganda, which neighbors Kenya. And what the president did in the year 2012, he banned export of raw minerals from Uganda. So if you want to go and do mining in Uganda, you must process, you must do the manufacturing there. So that is value added. Kenyans who are seated there are aware that just the other day, Kenyan president and Ugandan president met somewhere in Trolo in Uganda because Devik company, which is doing steel manufacturing in Kenya, was told by the Ugandan president, you cannot be importing the raw material from Uganda to Kenya, come and do the manufacturing here. So the problem is actually value added. Navindia, the largest AI company in terms of market capitalization, where is the company getting raw materials for the hardware? DRC. Suppose we do the value addition on that, so that the manufacturing and processing is done in DRC. So it's not that we don't have the comparative advantage. It's not that we don't know how to identify. The problem is what we do with the mineral sector. And it's only Botswana in the entire Africa which is able to convert minerals into processed final products, and it accounts for over 25% of GDP. Look at the 10 poorest countries in Africa. They draw 12% of their revenue from minerals, as opposed to the average of the middle income, which is 4.7%, and the high income, which is just 1.9%. So we have the cars of the print, the mineral cars. Look at agriculture. We can no longer boast that we have comparative advantage when it comes to agriculture. Look at cocoa, look at palm oil, look at rubber. In 60s, we were at par. Our economic structures and factor endowments, we were at par with Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, those East Asian countries. So we remained where we are on agriculture. The East Asia countries moved, and moved very quickly. So what do we do with our agriculture? Tea, for quite a number of Eastern African countries, we no longer have that comparative advantage. Sri Lanka and India are doing a lot of tea production. Coffee, we no longer have that. Brazil is there. What do we do with our coffee here in Kenya? We export raw beans. Neso, which is based in Switzerland, they process the raw beans. They come and sell to us here, Neso, Nescafe, in our supermarket. And we, the farmers, can't afford it in our supermarket. So we are exporting both the raw beans and jobs. So we need to do more than that. We need to do the value addition in terms of agro-processing, so that we are also manufacturing the agriculture inputs such as fertilizer in Africa and the machinery that goes into agro-processing. So it's not that we don't know what we need to do. So when you look at countries endowed with tourism sites, if I want to visit, say, Zimbabwe, I'll go to the website of Zimbabwe and I do a lot of homework. How is the political stability in Zimbabwe? The safety protocols? How about the process of obtaining visa for travel? These are the considerations that anybody that would want to visit any country will do. But are we doing that in terms of African countries? Look at the statistics, because they don't lie. Last year, Morocco attracted the highest number of tourists, 17 million, followed by Egypt, 16 million, then Tunisia, then South Africa at 9 million. Kenya, we have plenty of wildlife. We only attracted 2 million. So what does that tell you? You see, the northern countries, you'll find much of it is desert. Is it that the tourists are interested in going to see the desert? So those considerations of political stability. I want to mention something about southern coast in Kenya, somewhere known as Ukuda, where our tourists go. So you see on the news, a marauding gang carrying machetes during the day, about 100. If that is featured by CNN or BBC, how will we attract tourists? So there are these considerations that we need to put in practice so that we have diversification from, say, agriculture and the mineral resources for our economies. So it's not that we don't know what we need to do, Chair. There are also supportive policies, like I mentioned for tourism. There are also supportive policies for, say, mining and agriculture, special economic zones, infrastructure, particularly energy. In Kenya, last year alone, 2024, I know of 6 large multinationals that relocated to Egypt. Why? The business environment has become hostile in terms of taxation. Our corporate tax is 30%. Egypt is 22.5%. Electricity cost here, it is 4 times that of Egypt. So I go to the supermarket to buy toothpaste, which used to be manufactured here in Kenya. I see now it is written, manufactured in Egypt, so that our country has become a warehouse. Because we still have huge market for this. So these are issues that African governments need to put in consideration. It's not about identifying the sectors. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Peter, for all those challenges that Africa faces in trying to develop the sectors you're talking about. I understand Francesca has joined us, and if so, can I ask her the first question, which was the one about rethinking the classic growth model, about given Africa's reliance on sound macroeconomic fundamentals and export-led industrialization, the relevance of that in an environment which is now characterized by rising protectionism, automation, weaker global growth. Do these things still matter, or does this need to change? Francesca, are you able to?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My apologies. So over-reliance on technology to me this morning made all this mess. So my sincere apologies for this delay. Thank you, Andy. So let's think about this classical growth model and how that can be. It has to change looking ahead, no? So just let me start with a simple observation that we do nowadays. Many of us, I guess also many of you, we see in the data, and also we hear when we speak with entrepreneurs that there is a different way of thinking. You know, Africa now, we can feel it, is full of, I call it, new economic energy. There are new firms, new technologies are deploying, new value chains. We've been talking about that. I was just listening to the presentation before this. But yet, if you look at the economic structure of Africa, the change, the speed at which the structure is changing is much, much more slowly than the entrepreneurial capacity of the entire continent. So we observe this gap between dynamism on one side and structural transformation. And this gap that we see and that we observe is exactly why we need to rethink the classical growth model. And this thought is even more urgent today, I think, than ever. So if we look at backwards, as Andy was saying, for decades, this sort of standard narrative that we had, macro stability, openness, export-led industrialization, they were very, very important. They still are. And they offered a sort of coherent development path, okay? It matched back then a different world with respect to what we see now. The world was a world where global value chains were expanding. There was a growing demand for labor-intensive manufacturing. But today, the world is very, very different. We all see that every day. Today, automation, technologies, but not just technologies, those technologies that advance, I'd say that at unprecedented speed. Then we have protectionism, new geopolitical equilibria, and slower global growth have all reshaped this landscape that we see. So the escalator, the lift of industrialization that have many countries in the development path, yes, it's still there, but it's moving at a very different speed than what we used to see in the past as economies. So then the question, in my view, becomes, no, in this context, how do African economies translate their dynamism into a real structural transformation, no, when the traditional pathways of growth in the world are narrow? So just let me go a little into detail. Let me tell you about what the World Bank wrote a year ago, the World Bank Development Report, because it offered a very useful framework to think about structural transformation and industrial policy at the same time. No? So this framework is very simple. It's called the 3I framework: investment, infusion, and innovation. And in this context, to me, it provides a very useful way to think about this transformation. It's not a formula, okay? It's just a lens. It's a new pair of glasses that we need whenever we think about the possible source of economic growth. And it's very useful also because it helps to articulate a tension that every country faces, not only countries in the African continent, but Europe, US, wherever in the world. Whenever we think about growth, we have to think about a paradigm that relies on creative destruction, meaning having new firms, new technologies, new jobs, displacing old ones. No, whenever we think about also structural transformation in terms of moving from agriculture into tourism, as you were saying before. So this framework helps us to appreciate the balance between creative destruction on one side and the instinct to preserve the existing structure, okay? So this is a tension that it's at the heart of many, many industrial policies, okay? Creative destruction and the instinct of preservation. So let's dig just for 30 seconds into this 3I framework, and let's see how we can adapt this to this context. So investment decisions are there, and we know that they often embody a sort of strategic trade-off. Some investments look forward, meaning they build new capabilities, they support new emerging sectors. But then we have other investments that look inward, they look backward. No, they tend to stabilize existing industries and stability purposes. Neither approach, I would say, it's right or wrong. They both reflect legitimate priorities that a country or a government might have. But we have to remember that long-term growth tends to accelerate and be sustainable when investment expands new productive possibilities, not only when it reinforces the existing ones. Let's think about infusion. Infusion is related to skills because infusion is the spread of new ideas, new technologies, and generally know-how that naturally generates creative destruction, new products and new firms getting into the market. So new techniques, new technologies challenge established one, new firms reshape competition, and new tasks are spread in the market. But we know that in many African economies, this diffusion is very uneven, okay? So there are islands of high capacity, high capability, and with firms operating on the frontier, but there are many, many other where firms are far away from the frontier. So industrial policy is there. It can dampen this pressure or channel them towards upgrading the firms that are at the frontier to go towards the better ones. So how, at the end of the day, how this diffusion unfolds, it determines whether growth is transformative, okay, the creative destruction paradigm, or just defensive.
Okay.
If we look at innovation, it often emerges from adaptation, so new business models, new forms of value addition that we see. So the innovation typically comes from entrants and pioneers that experiments at the margin. So industrial policy is transformative. Just to wrap up because my time is almost over.
Yes.
I heard you, Andy. And when it works with these dynamics of sustaining creative destruction, then it might support learning and capabilities formation rather than anchoring to an old model. And let me conclude that saying to me, I mean, at this point, what matters is now to find a new equilibrium where creative destruction can generate new opportunities, while at the same time, industrial policy can help that change to take root in some ways that are socially and economically sustainable. So this is the new growth paradigm that I envisage for the future. Thank you so much, Andy. Sorry if I
Thank
was
you
a
so
little
much,
long.
Francesca. So I'd like to apologize for neglecting Oliver, but we'll come to Oliver in a minute. I'd like to think now about, we talked about exporting there, but I'd like to think about domestic markets and even import substitution, which was something that came up again yesterday in the discussion yesterday. So I'd like to ask Diana Ann, with the growing middle class in Africa, with deepening regional integration, is this a promising moment for some well-designed import substitution strategies? And if that route's going to be pursued, how do we avoid the sort of failures of the past? Is this a good thing to think about at all? And if we do, how do we avoid failures of the past?
Okay. So import substitution is quite a tricky or a very controversial subject because it goes along political lines, diplomatic lines, and all that. But I think it's an opportune moment because, like I said in the beginning, Africa is now considered, a continent to compete with globally. And in the 60s or 80s there, when import substitution was done, it was mostly without a strategy or without clear systems to protect the domestic market and at the same time help it grow. So there were no clear systems or technology to be able to boost and enable protectionism to work out. But right now, it's an opportune moment because we are harnessing the regional market as Africa, like I said. Integrations like AFCFTA is allowing African countries to trade within themselves. One research that we were doing with Professor Victor in the AERC, we found that intra-ESC trade has grown by about 13.1% in 2023. And this trade is actually, majority of the trade is manufactured goods, textiles, automotive, produced value-added products. So we are seeing that we can develop or, restructure the domestic market or the local African market to enable us to trade among ourselves on these value-added goods, which will help these industries, these small farms grow and focus on value addition rather than raw processing or raw production. So import substitution can work, but we need to have smart and to be disciplined in how we do it. Obviously, like my colleague, Ms. Moikia has said, the fiscal space is very limited, but if we know where to direct the finances, we know where to direct our resources, we harness the skills of the young people, the tech skills, the digital skills, the level of innovation that we have within Africa. If we harness all this, we will not need to have to export our own resources, but we can use them internally, protect ourselves, industrialize ourselves, help us to, expand so that as we trade among ourselves, we will still be able to reach global markets. Also, we can collaborate with advanced economies. We see China is now collaborating with Africa on a level of not godfather kind of relationship, but a collaborative relationship that is trying to lead to infrastructural growth, development within Africa. So we need to stop the perspective of needs basis, but we need to see that we have potential. We have potential in terms of resources. We have potential in terms of, our skills. I really have passion for the young people because we see how innovative they are and how ready they are to grow, to improve every time. We're not trying to stick to the old ways. We're trying to learn. Every day is a learning process. And also the advantage of the young people today is that the world has opened up. So we are not blinded by what the first world is doing. The social media is there, YouTube, all these things. We are able to see how they are producing, how they are acting, how they are doing, and we are able to learn from them. So the skill set is growing exponentially among the young people, especially the tech and the digital world. So we can harness this, we can grow and help us close our resources within ourselves, use those resources for industrialization, help and protect these businesses so that we can also come out to the world like we are here, we are competitive, we want to collaborate, we want to talk growth, we want to co-create. We don't want to, you use our resources for your own creation, but we work together and we co-create and we're able to grow together. So that's what I think about import substitution. It can work at this moment, at this now, and we are learning. So from the point of learning, it means that there is growth. We are able to learn from the mistakes of the first world. So that is the best kind of learning, actually, learning from the mistakes of the others. So we can do the industrial revolution. I usually say that we are in the revolution. The other revolution, the economic revolution right now is tech, is AI, is the digital, it's the green world. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diana. And the point that came up yesterday was if Africa is involved in producing in global value chains, why do all the inputs for that production need to be imported, and can some of them be produced in Africa as well? I think that's an important issue. So I'm conscious that I'm going to leave enough time at the end for some questions from the audience, but there's another at least 3 questions I'd like to put to panel members, if I may. And if I can come back to Francesca and ask you the question about industrial policy tools. Francesca, if I could ask you for a fairly succinct answer, just in the interest of managing time. So industrial policy instruments like industrial parks and skills development and quality infrastructure, are considered high impact and important interventions. What can Africa learn from its experience with these tools in the past, of trying to do these things in the past?
Thank you, Andy. Let me start with a very simple fact. Africa, of course, not only Africa, but Africa in particular, has been experimenting with industrial policy tools, I think, for decades. As you were saying, industrial parks, skill program, point infrastructure, clusters, none of these are new. There's a renewed interest right now. And also what is new is the context now. It's very different. As we were saying before, the world is changing, the world is going super fast, and technologies now evolve much faster than they used to do in the traditional industrialization cycles. And again, this balance that I was mentioning before between creative destruction on one side and preservation becomes, I think, right now, even more than before, central to policy design, in particular industrial policy design. So across the continent, to my understanding, industrial parks have been typically associated with a lot of optimism and sometimes some caution. We all have a list of success stories like Ethiopia, for example, Nigeria, Kenya, Tunisia, industrial zone, Morocco, you name it. No, we have a long list of success studies. What they share, in my opinion, is that typically this kind of industrial park, they don't create competitiveness. They reveal it. They reveal it because they are formed, in places where there were already some capabilities that complement each other and they self-reinforce. So they tend to work when they don't substitute for these capabilities. They just put together these capabilities in a very complementary way. And this is a point that in the literature has been raised also many, many years ago by scholars like Hausman and Broderick. They say that industrial parks succeed when they're part of a broader ecosystem that supports learning, upgrading, innovation, and firm creation on the side. So whenever these characteristics are there, those are ingredients for success. Again, I was briefly mentioning before about infusion. You were talking about skills, how easy and fast now people, especially the younger generation, can learn skills. And if we look at the programs, the skill programs that are formalized somehow in different countries, sometimes they were conceived for yesterday's production system rather than for today's evolving task. So we have to think that now skill system must move at the speed of the technology, the speed of the firm, not at the speed of the political or administrative cycles. Again, this is something that we should keep in mind. And also, the best performance are observed whenever feedback loops are built into the design of these policies, whether it's just an industrial policy, a skill initiative, or any other ingredients of these success stories. We need to collect regularly data, do longitudinal studies, firm surveys, and all the mechanisms that allow the programs to adjust quickly when technology changes, when shocks arise, so that they're very flexible. So what Africa has learned, I think Africa has learned a lot from itself, but also from experiences that happened in other countries. So first, countries that treated these tools as sort of standalone interventions, so very limited results. And this is clear. Industrial parks without skills, skills without clusters, standard without the upgrading of the firms, are only partial solutions doomed to fail at some point. So the successful cases tend to combine all this in a consistent and coherent ecosystem. Second, the difference between success and disappointment often lies in this capability building, not much into the physical infrastructure. So industrial policy works when it supports firm capacity to learn, to adapt, to experiment, and to participate in new value chains. Third, and this is crucial, especially in this context, we know that Africa has learned that good design of these policies is necessary, but very often is not sufficient. What matters just as much is the willingness to monitor, to evaluate, and correct on course these programs that might fail to adapt to emerging realities. So I'll stop here for the sake of time, and then if you want, Andy, we can do a second round. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesca. Oliver, with apologies for neglecting you up to this point. I would like to ask some questions about potentially ending support, but also measuring success of industrial policy. So how do we judge the success of industrial policy? But we often think of industrial policy as something for countries to do for a period of time. So how can African governments design industrial policy interventions with clear criteria for success and including evidence of learning by doing, productivity gains, export readiness, and avoid prolonged support for non-competitive industries? Oliver, if you would be able to speak to that.
Yes, I can. The microphone works. I expect that every African country has an industrial policy. They may not call it an industrial policy. It might be called a development strategy, a growth plan, a Vision 2030. Most countries have a number of them. And if you look at them, they're all very similar. And contained within them will be an industrial policy, and it will have elements of everything that my colleagues have discussed, that we all know. Yes, you have a list of what we know are the constraints on firms, a list of the things that governments can do, and a kind of an aspiration is, yes, we're going to do this and achieve a lot. That's not a plan. That's a vision. It's an aspiration. But it doesn't tell you anything about how you're going to get from where you are to where you want to be. Now you may, and if that's the situation, you can't evaluate if it's successful or not, because you've no milestones, you've no criteria, you've no guidance on the detail. Certain things are known that, yes, we've got a lot of evidence that certain things work. Export processing zones, perhaps industrial parks that are often related. You can evaluate, have exports increased? And you find, well, yes, they've been beneficial, but that can be risky. Recent work in Ghana found that firms that were producing for the domestic sector were far more resilient during COVID than the EPZ firms. And that's intuitively obvious. The EPZ firms were exposed to the global shock, whereas the firms that produced domestically were more resilient. Many African countries and firms will have discovered how vulnerable they are to Donald Trump's tariff policy. They were exporting for a particular market, taking advantage of AGOA, which seemed really useful, and then suddenly, overnight, it's gone. They're not resilient to that. So, yes, exporting is good, but there are risks. Industrial parks are often good, but often they become enclaves. They generate some employment, but they have very few linkages to the domestic economy. So they're not really what you want. I think what you want is an alternative way of thinking about it. That you start by trying to understand, and often by asking, the firms that have been relatively successful, how did they do it? How did they deal with the constraints? And which are the constraints they have that they find really difficult to deal with? Because we know that certain things are beneficial. You know, investment in better roads and ports, it benefits all firms, potentially. It gives them market access, it reduces trade costs, that's good. Improving customs and logistics through trade facilitation, that potentially benefits all firms. So there's things you can do that benefit all firms. But what you want to understand is, well, what is it about some firms that have allowed them to avail of these opportunities? And often that's very specific. It can be serendipity. It can be a particular network that they got involved in and discovered that, yeah, you know, there's a buyer in Europe who's willing to purchase fruit juice that's made in Ghana. Now that just happens by accident. It's not part of a plan. But there are firms like that. There are, you know, firms in Kenya or Uganda that are able to export some goods to Ghana or to Egypt or to Morocco. So you're kind of interested, okay, and not all of it is tea or coffee, but even if it is, if they're exporting coffee to Morocco, then you might ask, well, why aren't you also, would you also be able to export it to Tunisia or to Algeria? If you've already overcome some of these barriers. So you need to get more information, and this will be specific to every country, to understand, okay, the firms that are doing well, how have they addressed the constraints? What has the government done that has been helpful, and what is not helpful? And build it up that way. So you start by trying to find firms that can produce domestically, then they can expand perhaps to regional markets, because the African Continental Free Trade Area, in principle, it gives benefits. It's going to be implemented slowly, haphazardly, so don't expect that overnight everything's going to get rosy. It won't. But it's an opportunity. And an industrial policy has to be about how do firms benefit from these opportunities. If you know that, then you can assess success. And take a simple example. One of the most common government support policies is tax expenditures. They want to give incentives for investors to set up. So subsidies are expensive, so you could justify tax expenditures, giving them concessions or relief from profits tax for a period of time or from tariffs on imported goods or whatever. They're costly because of revenue foregone. They're also often lack transparency, and it's not clear why some firms get it and some firms don't. Those can be addressed. There is a potential benefit because you can evaluate these if the decision is made. One of the big problems is they exist, but they're never evaluated. They never try to work out, well, but you could evaluate them just by simply telling firms, well, okay, you want this tax concession or relief, that's fine, but we want a brief report each year telling us how has this benefited you and what have you done. Now, there are ways around it, but it's a way of approaching evaluation so you can judge if something's successful. More elaborate ways to do it, the type of ways that economic researchers would like to do it, great if it's possible, but not feasible for day-to-day evaluation of success. So far more depth and detail on specific firms, what's made them successful, and how does government facilitate firms to grow from domestic to regional, perhaps to global markets.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I've been told we need to finish the panel a bit earlier, so I'm going to give one last question to Wangari. I'm going to give opportunity for a couple of questions from the floor, but we should finish. We need to finish slightly earlier. So, Wangari, the question is about the relevance of industrial policy in the context of AFCFTA, which touches a little bit on what Oliver just said. Does AFCFTA make industrial policy more important? Does industrial policy support the implementation of AFCFTA? Can you just give us your reflections a little bit about any relationships between AFCFTA and industrial policy in Africa?
The AFCFTA and the industrial policy really are two sides of the same coin, right? So AFCFTA will thrive off the back of industrial policy of different nations, of different African nations, and industrial policy can really multiply and actually expand through the AFCFTA. So I think they're inextricably linked, and I think the different nations should be able to really capitalize on the opportunities presented by both. Now, I think one of the challenges that the AFCFTA have been having, and there have been several, but one of them is really working with countries around thinking through the revenue loss from reducing the tariffs for entry of goods into their countries. But my view is that we need to think about this. African countries need to really think about this from a broader point of view, right? Because the opportunity, and I know we are in a room of professors and economists, so I say this with my chest in terms of hyperbolic discounting and opportunity cost, right? I think that's where the nexus is. We can think about how do we forgo the immediate revenues that we're receiving now for the future revenues that we'll be seeing in the medium to long term, if we're able to really get strong industrial policy and really inculcate the ethos and the frameworks of the AFCFTA. So this means looking beyond the revenues that are received from the border and looking towards the revenues from the productivity from industry that we're building within borders. There's also a geopolitical dimension, of course. I think this is one of the main constraints that we're seeing with the AFCFTA. And then you couple that with what happened with now the reduction of aid, USAID going down, and different development partners reducing their support. We look at AGOA now expired, and we look at, I think those are challenges, but I think therein lies an opportunity. because I think what we scramble to do is to try to make sure, try to repair those relationships, prolong those engagements. But what we can be doing as different African nations is look within and look towards each other. How can we start to create the networks and linkages within each other that we can start to strengthen trade so that we're not always so globally exposed, right? Our tendency has been, if the West is not cooperating, we're going to move east. What are we doing to look inward? What are we doing to build those linkages? And I think now that critical minerals is becoming a big opportunity, rare earth minerals, we're seeing a lot of interaction from that perspective. How can we start to create trade relationships that are internally beneficial, and not only internally beneficial to our nations, but also regionally? How do we start to think about the point that Professor Morrissey said? I think it's professor or doctor. I always forget if I don't know if it's professor or doctor. Professor, I'm sure. Oliver. The SEZs, we have there's a lot of opportunity in the special economic zones, industrial parks, but there's also a lot of challenges that come out from those arrangements. But the trick is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to think about how do we revamp those. And I think the AERC, with the knowledge and the research that you have, really support government to start to think about practical ways of revamping SEZs, industrial parks, to make them more useful and make sure that they are also investing in the economy rather than just in a small ecosystem that it's importing goods and exporting them without creating capacities within the region.
Thank you so much, Wangari. This issue about making trade relations particularly effective for African countries individually and collectively, I think is very important, including in rare earth minerals. This is a really critical issue. Now, the reason for finishing slightly early is we're going to have another presentation after this session, but I'd like to give an opportunity for a couple of questions from the floor if people would like to ask questions to the panel. So I have 1, 2, 3. So let me take the 3 I see. 1, 2, Wale, and 3.
Thank you very much. My name is Sekou Kamara. I'm representing the BCAO here, the Central Bank of West African State. Since this is the first time I'm speaking, I would like to, thanks the AERC for the invitation, and also for the warm welcome since we have been here. My main concern about the revival of the industrial policy has to do with the financing issue. Usually it's costly, this kind of policy. You have the fiscal side, the fiscal incentives, and also you have the investment you have to make. And all of us know that this time around, many countries are facing huge debt issues, so the fiscal space is very limited. So I don't know if the panelists could, talk about the financing constraints that could, restrain the feasibility of the industrial policy this time around. Maybe. I don't know, that's why I think I will have some sympathy for the approach consisting to invest in the economy broadly, so to let the private sector choose what it is best to do to develop the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Wale and behind, can we ask for fairly focused questions, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think mine is more like comment, but if possible, I want the panelists to also expatiate on this. Listen to Francesca, listen to Oliver, Wangari, and co. It is interesting that, yes, we know there is one form of industrial policy or the other in different countries. But my worry is the coherence of that policy with other policies. Yes, Wangari, you mentioned the issue of trade and the industrial policy, the issue of short run versus long run in terms of our thinking and so on. How do we achieve the balance? Because if you say today, let's forget about the revenue, how do we survive until we get to the industrial development? Yes, it must be highly selective if we want to go that way, but I think there is need when we are talking to African countries to listen to where they are currently and the constraints, and they use technology, if possible, to leapfrog. Some of the African countries are still in the old way of running the economy. And that has to change. So it is important to look at a different element. I like the element of policy implementation, evaluation, and monitoring. Yeah. It is no longer where you just leave it and say, yes, we have the policy, but it must be hands-on in order to achieve the goal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Leon Sindikumana from the University of Massachusetts wants to appreciate the panelists for insightful insights. I want to come back to the points made by Professor Peter. Excellent. In terms of the constraints to investment, what drives investors out of our countries, or what prevent them from coming. But I want to touch on the issue you mentioned about taxation. You said some companies have moved from Kenya to Egypt. Kenya has a higher tax rate, 30%. Egypt has a tax rate of 22%. I think tax should be considered in the context of other constraints to investment, and not engage in a race to the bottom so that you think a lower tax will attract more investment. What incentivizes investment is a complement of factors including political stability, a good predictable regulatory environment, ease of doing business, infrastructure, and then a skilled labor force. But tax is only one element. And I would not want countries to say, okay, if we downgrade our tax regime, we're going to attract more investment. First, that's the first thing. The other is tax rates are only a legal instrument. We know how much taxes companies do not pay, because you can set any tax rate you want. A tax over a 0% profit is zero money because of tax evasion, base erosion and through transfer pricing. So unless you fix the whole environment, regulatory environment, the tax instrument is very ineffective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leons. Very conscious of time and the need to finish quickly, but I'd like to invite quick responses. I'm going to invite Wangari, Oliver, and Peter in that order, if you could answer the questions in the order that they were asked, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your fantastic questions. In terms of financing industrial policy, I think, yes, this is a very big concern across the room and across different nations. I think there are 3 to 4 ways I think we can think about how to manage the fiscal aspect. I think number one, I mentioned innovation and regulation. These are what I call zero fiscal impact opportunities, right? I think regulation, allowing the private sector to move forward without too much regulation, but also using existing research. I think there's a lot of research that exists that is not being harnessed. And those are low-hanging fruit that you can immediately use, governments can immediately use. I think the challenge is really just translating this innovation research into policy and used by policymakers. So I think about what are the zero budget implication innovations that we can use. I think number 2 is coordination. There's a lot of resources and money, financial resources wasted by duplication of efforts by different ministries. There's very minimal coordination that is happening. I know in Kenya, I'm not sure, and I'm pretty sure in actually in other African countries, where you find an intervention by one department is duplicated by another, and then there's a loss of the opportunity. There's a lack of efficiency. So I think coordination is key. The third one is use the resources that you have in a targeted fashion, very targeted interventions. Don't go the broad-based way, trying to invest in everything. Look at what the comparative advantage is. Rely on research from AERC and other players to understand what our comparative advantage is, how can we support the ecosystem, and put the money there to enable the private sector to thrive. You don't have to build the investment yourself. Build the ecosystem through which the private sector then can bring resources to bear. So,
Oliver, do you want to answer quickly on Wale or anything else?
Yes, I'll partly give my answer by slightly altering Tolstoy's phrase on families. Unsuccessful firms fail for the same reasons. Successful firms succeed for all different reasons. Industrial policy, or successful industrial policy, is about what many different individual firms do. I don't think governments are very good at identifying the firms. Firms are the ones who can identify the opportunities. What government can best do is facilitate, provide, as Peter said earlier, the testing and training type, or testing and standards type facilities that are necessary to ensure that products meet the appropriate standard for different markets. That's something that a service that government can provide, but it benefits all firms potentially. Many investments benefit all firms. The problem with, you might want to target to attract investment, but it should be time limited, and you should require the beneficiaries to demonstrate how they have used the benefits. Otherwise, it will fail for the reasons that we can all list. And Leonce identified the reasons why you don't want to over-depend on multinational enterprises and foreign investment. So help domestic firms to grow. Just do that. It's really difficult, but focus on that.
Peter, quickly, in answer to Leonce and anything else.
Thank you, Ade. The question on financing. In September, there was an international summit like this one in Uganda on development finance institutions. I was one of the panelists. And it is true, like you say, that industries require heavy capital. But the fiscal space for the African governments is so thin, so thin. So what are the policy options? I remember the chief guest there, President Museveni, making noise to Uganda Development Bank that Uganda Development Bank, you are getting taxpayers' money. But you are lending at 15% to industries. So how do they grow? So African governments have to come up with innovative financing methods for the industries. And one would be to allocate development banks, which are state-owned, money during the appropriations in Parliament. Because the industries, to recoup back money, it takes years. And commercial banks, like in Kenya, cannot exceed 84 months, which is 7 years. So it's not just access to capital by industries from the development banks, but also at what cost? At what cost? Kenya, the CBR rate is 9.25. In Rwanda, it is 6.75. But then you talk of inflation dynamics, and you really cannot use supply-side inflation shocks on monetary policy committee to come up with high central bank rate. So other innovative financing models would include PPP, would include perhaps going for diaspora bonds specifically for the industries, would perhaps utilization of the pension funds. I go to the issue raised by my friend Leonce there. Actually, you are very right. You are very right. It's a combination of factors that are chasing away the industries from Kenya. That's why I also mentioned electricity. If you look at the business-friendly indicators from the World Bank 2024, Rwanda is ranked number 35. Kenya is ranked number 129. That perhaps explains why M-Post, a big company, has relocated from Kenya to Rwanda. And if you look at the high cost of lending in Kenya, the source of capital for farms is also quite high in Kenya. So it is basically what I would call the unfriendly business environment. And the taxes is not just the corporate. If you are importing inputs for manufacturing, say cement, you import clinker, the tax had been put as now 17.5%. The same for steel, the iron ore. And if you're importing raw materials for paper manufacturing, this has gone up to 10%. It is predictability and certainty of the taxes which we do every year. The VAT in Kenya is of 2013, which has not been changing since 2013. But we are doing finance bill every year and coming up with variation in taxes, and therefore there is no predictability. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Conscious of time, and we do need, unfortunately, to conclude the discussions at this point. But this is going to be, as we've heard, a really important priority for AERC and its 10-year strategy. Industrial policy and implications for growth strategy is going to be a major focus. There's lots, I think, of important insights that have come out of this discussion. I'm not going to try and list and summarize them in the interests of finishing us succinctly. But I would like to thank the panelists for really great insights on a whole wide range of issues. Thank you very much to the panelists for their contributions, and thank you to AERC for the invitation to hold this panel. And as I say, thank you to all the panelists for their contributions. Charles, Abby, do you want to?
Excuse me, before you leave the panel, we need to present you with some gifts, and I'll request the ED to come and graciously present the gifts. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. A round of applause to the panelists. Thank you very much, Professor Andy McKay, for pushing you, for at least allowing us to save some time. We want to transition quickly to the next session before we go for a break, and this is the official opening session of the parallel session 2, which is on regional policy engagement workshop for East Africa. That is a PASH farm. We have a special guest whom I'll
Recording
quickly...
stopped.
We have a special guest whom I'll invite our executive director to introduce.